Hi everyone, this is Craig Zels from PCDN Global here for the latest live stream of our Social Change Career podcast. Today we're here with Esha Chhabra. This is season 11, episode 8. So we're about halfway through season 11. This is going to be an amazing session where we're talking partially about Esha's career as a journalist in the impact space, her new book, also about career paths, and really about regenerative business, which we need a lot more of in the world. For people who have not joined us previously, this session is live streamed. So we really like to hear from our listeners, whether it's your first time or your repeat engager. So please let us know in the chat box where you're watching from, a few sentences about yourself. And also we'd like to hear questions and comments that we try to weave in throughout the conversation. I will summarize Esha's bio and then we'll jump right in. So let me just get the right screen. So we're going to be talking about rethinking business and impact careers with a regenerative lens. So we're really going to dive into what does that mean and how to avoid greenwashing and what does it mean, both the positive and negative role of impact and business in general. Esha has been a writer and journalist focused on global development, the environment, and business for over a decade. Her work has appeared in many leading outlets, including the New York Times, The Economist, The Guardian, Forbes, The Washington Post, Fast Company, Wired, and many more. She goes beyond greenwashing to determine if companies are actually pushing the needle for positive impact. Her work has been supported by the UN Foundation and the Pulitzer Center in Washington, D.C. She's a graduate of Georgetown University and the London School of Economics and Political Science. She was born in Delhi and currently lives in Southern California. In full transparency, Esha was a student in a class I taught, not on business. I think it was art and peace building, or was it business?
Yeah,
It
it
was
was art and peace.
art and peace building. So many years ago, back at Georgetown. Esha, we're delighted to have you here today. So thank you for joining us. And just to start off with, and I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. So just to start off with, can you talk a little bit about what is the thread that has weaved your career together in terms of the focus or the product?
Thank you, Craig. It's so nice to reconnect also after all these years. I think the common thread is storytelling. I mean, I am a product of the 80s and 90s, and this is when, cable news was at its height. And so I was really passionate about watching the news and watching documentaries and watching whatever was coming on CNN in those days. And I was really interested in storytelling. But when I was at Georgetown, it was interesting enough that I did those internships in television news in the DC bureaus. And I realized that that wasn't the right format for me. I didn't want to do that, but I did want to do storytelling. And so over the years, whatever I've done, whether it's been in the capacity as a journalist, writing articles, writing a book, and even doing storytelling with clients, it's all been, how do we tell these stories in a manner that's more engaging, interesting, less jargon? It's easier for folks to connect with.
And so the question that we like to ask people is, if you think back to your younger age, when I was younger, I started reading the stock page when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And I was interested in business and social change, and I used to ski a lot, so I wanted my own ski mountain. But I mean, obviously that never happened. But if you think back to your younger self, did you envision a particular career path or skill path or aspire to be, whether it was an astronaut or a journalist, or like how in the world did you go from undergrad to grad to storytelling as a career?
I mean, I think I was always interested in stories. That's definitely the truth. I've always been someone who's also been inclined to watch people's interviews. Like, I've always found that format really interesting, to learn somebody's story. So before, when we were just watching television, it was like the one-on-one kind of news interviews where they would have a 30-minute segment with someone and you would get to learn their whole story, or it could be a biography that you would read. I was more inclined always to that kind of content. And as I mentioned, I grew up really in the 90s. That's when I was a teenager. And so for me, that was the peak of cable news. And I was so fascinated with that world. So when I went to Georgetown, I actually picked Georgetown as a school because it was in DC, and I knew that there would be those opportunities outside the classroom that I could do. So I'd always fantasized, I think, about being a journalist. I think I always wanted to pursue, some form of storytelling. I didn't realize it would be writing. And honestly, it was at Georgetown when I had a professor, an English professor in the English department, who really pushed me. And he was like, "Hey, I think you can write quite well. Like, you need to focus on the writing side and less on the sort of TV broadcast stuff." And that's what really gave me confidence to then pursue text as opposed to visuals. And it's also easier. I mean, when you think about it, right? It's like less resources. You can just kind of get out there and do it. You don't need a whole team. And, we didn't have smartphones then that you could film stuff with. So I think that was always in the back of my mind. Like, how do we tell these stories? How do we share stories of interesting individuals?
And if you think back to, and just to get into, what did you study at Georgetown in terms of your major? Were you an English major? And then, how did you make that connection in terms of the professor saying, "Hey, you are really talented at writing and you have a compelling way to tell stories that other people might appreciate"? So how did you go from thinking about the broadcast journalism to actually writing? Did you write for the Georgetown, I think, for the Hoya? Did you write for
Yeah.
off campus? And then how did you start landing your first either paid or unpaid opportunities?
Yeah, so I had this really lovely professor freshman year, and I can't remember if it was first or second semester, but it was like one of those introductory English classes that we were all required to take. And I remember taking that class, and his name's Professor O'Malley, and he pulled me aside one day when we were having, those kind of open hours where you could go talk to a professor, and he said, "I think you should really do my other class." And his other class, though, was with seniors, and I was terrified. I was like, "I'm not going to sit in a class with seniors and read these really dense novels and then be able to analyze them and write essays about them, as well as, people who've been here for 3 years longer than I have." But I mean, I think about it now, like the teachers that we've had over the years, gosh, they have such an influence, and the kind of work that you've done. It's so important. I also had a teacher in high school who, interestingly enough, and now I'm friends with, and we always joke about this, because she gave me, I think, like a C on one of my essays. And it was great motivation to just get out there and say, "Okay, how can I improve this?" But yeah, I mean, English was not my forte in high school. It was when I went to college and I got that support from the teacher. And then I said, "Okay, let me do this." So I did major in English. And then at the time, we had just developed, I think, a journalism program. It was only a couple years old. There was like a little, course that you could do a few classes. So I enrolled in that, and we had a journalist from the Washington Post who came in and taught one course, and that was also really interesting because he forced us to go out in the city and actually do firsthand reporting and look at documents in the archives and all of that. And then post Georgetown, I was pretty kind of frustrated. I mean, I would go to these bureaus, and this was the era of George W. Bush being in office. And my job was really, when I was in the bureaus, to like run around the Capitol building and get sound bites from Condoleezza Rice or Donald Rumsfeld, because I was working for the congressional correspondent. And while it was all fun and exciting when you're 18 years old, it was also a reality check that television news has its limits. You are part of a production team, so you kind of have to go with what everybody else is saying. And you realize that some of the stories that I think maybe perhaps resonate with you and I were not getting the same amount of attention, right? It was a lot of politics. It was a lot of just the daily headlines. Um, so that's what made me think, okay, well, how do we get these other stories out there? And then I was introduced to Rotary, which is an organization, like, I mean, as an 18, 19-year-old, I didn't know anything about Rotary, right? But once I learned about it, I was like, gosh, this is so nice. Like, all these people around the world working on humanitarian projects that are close to their heart, whether locally or internationally. And they had a fellowship. And I don't know if they still have this fellowship, but that fellowship allowed me to do my master's in London. And through them, I got introduced to the work that they were doing at the time on polio. And so I spent time in the field with WHO, UNICEF, all of their partners, looking at how you do, development work really on a day-to-day basis. And it was when I was out in the field, I said, these are the stories I want to tell, like the stories of these incredible social entrepreneurs. So I started freelancing, and I sent my ideas to, I remember, the Chronicle in San Francisco, the Atlantic, the Guardian. And I don't know if it's because of the timing was just right. I mean, this is like 2009, 2010. And so people were receptive to these stories, and I was grateful for these editors who said, sure, like we'll run this or we'll work with you on this. And that really gave me the ability to then say, okay, let's do more storytelling around social entrepreneurship. And then that became my beat, basically, which was unique at the time because not a lot of people were covering it. So I'll pause there.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So I've done a lot of work with Rotary, their Peace Fellowship, which is going very strong. In full transparency, they recruit on PCDN, but I've also reviewed, and I think that Rotary reorganized their fellowship programs, but I know other people have had that fellowship. So I would encourage anyone who's thinking, one is the Rotary Peace Fellowship applications open, I think February 1st, but Rotary has a number of fellowship and scholarship programs. So,
Mhm.
take a look at their website because I have a friend who she actually used to work for us who had a similar opportunity where I think they funded her master's degree in Glasgow. And also just for fellowships in general, PCDN and ProFellow are two great resources. I'm just going to welcome a few people here. So welcome Jean-Louis from Seattle, welcome Mohammed from Pakistan, Philip from Nairobi, um, Alexander from Florida. Jennifer, I think you started to put a question in, but it got cut off, so feel free to put that some more. Mark from Nigeria. So please keep letting us know where you're watching from and your questions. Um, so to go back a little bit, um, I mean, one is we can talk about the state of journalism or media, which let's get to in a little bit. But if you just think about the skills when you started reporting, whether it was for congressional,
Mhm.
I forgot the name of the exact institution, or as a freelancer, for anyone who wants to work in communication and specifically on reporting, stories, whether it's in their hometown or in the field, what skills do you think are the most useful, both back then and back then, it sounds like 100 years ago because digital media has
Yeah.
changed so much, but for today, so people who are thinking about they really want to either tell their own stories or help share and amplify the stories of things that are working, like solutions journalism, or things that are not working. Like, what are the skills that are most critical in building a thriving and somewhat successful career in this space?
I think in a way, so when I graduated, it was 2007, and I did my master's in 2009, 2010. This was pre-social media, right? So, or at least the explosion of social media that we have seen. But I think today, in a way, there's even more opportunities. Like for me, when I think about it, there were really the traditional outlets that I could pitch to, and actually get paid and turn it into a career. Whereas now there's far more opportunities. So here's a few things I would say. In a way, it seems like there's a lot more noise today, that there's just so many different outlets and so many different platforms. And so, how do you figure out to even get out there? But what really gave me also a lot of help was actually writing for the local newspaper. So I am based north of Los Angeles in Ventura County, and there's a local newspaper here. And I met with the editor, and he said, "We'll give you a column because we think your voice is interesting and it's different from what they were working on." And that consistency of just having to turn out content every single week, every Sunday, having a story that would appear, you're not getting paid a lot of money. So be ready to kind of sacrifice that in the beginning. But if you can find a platform that's maybe less publicized or less, prominent, and then start to build clips there. I mean, because it's all dependent on your work. Like, what have you done in the past? And then from there, think about it this way. Today, there's more and more places that you could possibly place a story than ever before, right? And all of these platforms are looking for content, actually. Like, they really do need help filling up their pages, their digital pages. So you just have to understand the craft of pitching. And I think that is a bit of an art. Like, you have to learn how to captivate people's interest in about a paragraph or two via email. And so obviously in journalism, we learn who, what, where, when, why, the basics. But you need to also connect it to, why are we running this story today? Why are we featuring this issue today, and connect it to a current event? The media always wants a hook to the current news or the current, ongoing discussions. So I think in a way you can start and just start pitching your ideas. But like, it's not easy to do this kind of work. And so if you are going to be out in the field, just know that there will be lots and lots of days where it's not necessarily going to go your way. And it might be frustrating to find, the right subjects that you want to interview. So it is going to be something that will take time. It's not going to be a quick overnight success. But you need empathy. You need to learn to listen to people. You need to learn to put your own perspective aside many times, even if you don't, agree with something. And you need to be patient, for sure. Like this is, I mean, today I've published a book, but you've known me since 2007, right? It's taken a long time. We're at 15 years. So be prepared for that. Also, I actually think I was just speaking to university students last week, and several of them were asking me, like, how do we tell these stories more? I said, well, you have a tool in your hand now. And it's amazing to me that a lot of the storytelling today, even with climate change, with social impact, is still very didactic. It's still very preachy, right? Like it's still very much so like we should do this because this is sort of like a higher moral ground. But if you can make that story instead fun, entertaining, it could be a travel piece in a way where you're showing some other part of the world, people are much more likely to connect to it. And you can do that now with Instagram, with TikTok, with all these things, and make really short 30-second videos. It doesn't have to, require loads and loads of funding to make it happen. Um, so I think in a way you have far more opportunities today. Also, somebody else gave me this advice early on was sometimes if you can figure out how to cobble together the resources, just go out there and do it first and then come back and show to people like, hey, this is what I was thinking of what I could do for you. Because then people can kind of visualize it far quicker and easier, and they're more likely to say yes if they can see the end result is like a good product. So I think if you could figure out how to do that, devote some time to it and some money and resources, whatever you require, then you'll have a great portfolio that you can show people, and they're far more likely to be inclined to work with you.
Thank you so much. So the questions are starting to come in. I'll ask one more for now, then I'll start weaving in some of the questions. And please check out Esha's book, Working to Restore, Harnessing the Power of Regenerative Business to Heal the World. You can find it at Amazon and lots of other sites. And it's in Kindle version, hardcovers, or an audiobook version as well.
And there's a paperback coming out next year in March. So
okay,
well.
yes. So just two more questions, then we'll move on. So one is, I've done a lot of consulting and freelance. I know for more in the development and impact side, and freelance journalism can be very challenging. So you can just talk a little bit about how you've been able, and if someone is new to journalism, how does it actually work? Like you pitch, and like, is there an average? I don't want to know your salary, but like, is there an average compensation rate, and is it possible to put together a decent living as an independent media professional? And then kind of what's the general process? Like how do you come up with a potential story? So you read about it, someone pitches you. You've been following certain sectors or geographic regions for years. So like how long does it take between the process of you either having the idea or someone sharing it with you to actually finding a place to publish it?
Mm-hmm. So when you're doing a piece that requires travel or reporting and getting out to a place and seeing it in person, it does take a bit of time. People would often, once you write a couple things, like people will pitch you. So you can obviously refer to those as ideas, but also like, I mean, if you're reading something and something captures your imagination, you could call up that organization and say, hey, can I learn a little bit more? I'm interested in possibly pursuing this as a story. And people are very happy to talk to you as long as you have some kind of outlet that they can see that they would like to be featured in. So I've done both, and now it's a lot of people sort of just pitching you on a daily basis. But even now, I'll keep my eyes out for organizations or companies that I think, oh, that's kind of interesting. I might be traveling and I might just see it, or I might be out during my day and come across something. So it can be like that. The process used to be very simple. You would just craft a pitch. So again, like keep it at 2 paragraphs or so. Find the contact and email address for the editor that you want to pitch to. Just be really mindful when you send these pitches that you've done some homework and really looked at what they've written about, what their style is, what their tone is as a publication. The more you can kind of make it easy for them to say yes, the more likely you're going to get a yes. And then, can you make a living doing this? Yes, you can. I would say in the beginning, you need to supplement your income with something else, probably, because media just does not pay a lot, especially for independent journalism. So, I have over the years been asked to do editorial work for private clients, companies, nonprofits, foundations, civil sector. So I've also done that where maybe they need help with their blog or their report or, a campaign that they're doing. So I've done all of that as well over the years. And in terms of striking success with journalism, I think you really need to be you really need to have a clear focus. Like for me, it became this social entrepreneurship, social impact. And at the time that I started, there was less reporting on it. So it was something new and it was interesting and it became my beat. So people knew me for that. I think if you can create a focus and a bit of a niche, it really does help distinguish you from everybody else out there. And then editors tend to think of you also when they have something along those lines that they'd like coverage. And they'll come back to you and say, I'd really love to work with you on that because you know that space. Um, that said, it can be also really demoralizing. I mean, many of us talk about this where you'll send out 50 pitches and you might only hear back from like 3 or 4 people. And that's unfortunately just the nature of the game and the business. And I do sometimes wonder, like today, with the kind of overload of email, LinkedIn, all these platforms that we have, it's becoming harder and harder to keep up with all the messages. So I do see that also with editors just not being able to read everything and get back to everyone. They just can't. I mean, it's not physically possible for them. So I would say don't be dissuaded by it. Just be persistent. You can follow up also every week if you don't hear back from someone for a couple weeks and see if you get any response out of them. But it is definitely something where you're just pitching a lot, of the time, and then you're maybe getting a success rate there of like, less than 5%.
But I would assume as your experience and I mean, not that you don't have credibility, but your public credibility increases, that the pitch rate would increase, and then you get much more quality inbound pitches too.
Absolutely, and the other thing that, it's like any other industry, I almost wish I had done this earlier. I mean, I was ambitious, but I was also a very quiet, shy kind of individual, and I wish that I had kind of gone to more networking events when I was early on in my career, or just, built more of those networks. I think that that is such a critical part of building any career because it's amazing to me. Like, I mean, we connected in your classroom 15 years ago, and I've seen the success of all the things you've built over the years. But it's really amazing to me that how you circle back with people if you stay in the same industry 10, 15,
Yep.
20 years down the road. So really cultivate those relationships early on. And they don't need to be transactional every time, right? Like just build a relationship with someone because you really enjoy their work or appreciate what they do. I think that really gives back to you down the road, sometimes in ways that you can't imagine.
Yeah, a friend of mine gave me the book Adam Grant's Give and Take, and he's like, not that I
Mm,
am only a giver, but he's like that kind of reflects what he sees in PCDN to some degree, and I think transactional networking is atrocious, demoralizing, frustrating, and curiosity, empathy, and just like, hey, I don't need anything, just you're cool or your work is interesting. And like those kind of things without any agenda is like what leads to magical collaboration. But it's like, hey, would you get me a job? Right? Like the transactional asking for something or even planning in 2 months down the road to ask for something just is such a it's not the way of the impact world. Of course, we all need resources. So I'm going to start bringing in some questions. So Jennifer is a 30-year-old impact entrepreneur focusing on global youth employment. She's just talking about that, it's becoming much more divisive in the world, and also expertise, at least in many countries, has become increasingly devalued. And the idea of public intellectuals or experts or academics. So she asked a question in terms of how do you see the space around both expertise, but also funding for social impact, kind of reporting on social impact? Is that growing, or is there kind of, I mean, some people talk about, let's say, not the dumbing down of media, but just that like people, and it's also people's attention spans are much shorter. That in the
yeah,
past, maybe
yeah.
somebody would read a 20-page article in the Atlantic, and now it's like not everybody, but they want like the one-page version or the 30-second TikTok.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do think that content that's shorter does better. I have seen some of those long, really incredible reporting that's gone into these, 5,000 word articles or 10,000 word articles. And sadly, they don't seem to get as many eyeballs as they should or they did once upon a time. So, yes, I agree with you in terms of, so if we break it down, the media question about, what is resonating in people's attention spans, shorter stuff definitely does better. But that also gives you, in a way, like if you are a content creator of any kind, whether it's journalistic or not, I mean, you need to turn out stuff more consistently, for sure. It's not the less is more kind of thing. It's now, it should be less is more, but you have to be consistent along the way. And then in terms of funding, yes, there is a lot of funding out there. It's like what we were talking about earlier, though. You need to build a network that can kind of open those doors and opportunities for you also, and help you find the right places that you can get funding for. So I remember coming across the Pulitzer Center, gosh, like literally not 10 years ago. And at that time, they had a really small pool of, programs that they had funded and journalists that they had funded. It was less competitive to get a grant. Today, I think it is more competitive to get a grant because there are far more people applying. So that is the reality. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, that is something just to be mindful of. But there are resources out there. I mean, you brought up Solutions Journalism Network. So when people say, like, is it getting worse or is it getting better? I mean, David Bornstein, who started Solutions Journalism Network and is a dear friend and a mentor for me, the way that he's been able to build that organization up over the last decade shows that there is growing appetite for this. But the change is happening, I would say, maybe slowly. And for those of us who are in the space, we're a bit impatient and we want it to happen faster. But the fact that more and more media houses and more media newsrooms are like willing to even explore this idea, there's far more happening out there. The other thing is, I would say, I started writing about the word sustainability, and now, we've shifted to regenerative. But I would say around 2013, 2014, it was really coming into the lexicon. And when you look at the way that word and that idea, which was really like corporate social responsibility or something that was happening off to the side at a company, has now just become completely mainstream. There is progress there happening, right? The problem is that some of it is greenwashing, some of it's not authentic. There are obviously good apples and bad apples. But I think overall, there is actually more momentum. It's just, I do feel this, even this challenge myself, is like there's so much more noise you have to cut through to be successful now. So whether you're an organization fundraising or you're just trying to like put content out there, either way.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Jean-Louis has a question thinking about ecological. He's working on ecological and social entrepreneurship. So he's asking about the difference between the sustainable business, which tends to be more large companies, versus genuine social entrepreneurship or impact. Which angle have you focused on your storytelling, and do you see a difference both in your career and storytelling? So let's say, to put this in context, I won't name a specific company. Let's say a large multinational that is, let's say doing more sustainability a little bit in the supply chain or recycling or electric cars, but like maybe their fundamental products still destroying the planet or their services. And then let's say a social enterprise, whether for-profit, nonprofit, hybrid, where really everything from sourcing to employment to sales to marketing, everything is impact. So how do you address that question from John? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Craig, you kind of broke it down. The reason why I wrote this book was I started this project in 2018. And at the time already, I could see what was happening with the sustainability space, that there was a lot of co-opting of the work, but basically of the word, but it wasn't necessarily being executed. It was more marketing than action happening. And so the companies that I featured, there's 30 companies roughly that I featured in the book, and they're all, I would say, medium-sized companies. So they are private, they're not public, and they are far more looking at impact in every aspect of their organization. And I think that's where now there's this, terminology developing as to how to be a regenerative business, which is why the publisher put that in the second title and the subtitle, is that how do these companies distinguish themselves from the so-called sustainability efforts of the huge corporations? And, B Corp was one way to do that. In a way, that was a certification that did walk you through some of the aspects of your business. B Corp doesn't cover everything. It doesn't get as far into the climate change, environmental stuff and supply chain stuff. But if you want ideas of companies that are looking at creating impact at every level of their business, that's what this book is for. And, when I talk about regenerative business, I sort of explain it as a multi-tiered cake. And so it's like layer upon layer upon layer of impact. And that's what makes the whole thing really enticing. Whereas you're right, like sustainability was really one aspect of the business. And it's interesting, all the companies I interviewed, pretty much all of them, said we don't use the word sustainability out here. They were like allergic to it. They said, we don't want to use that word. So some of them had gravitated to transparency, traceability. Others had started to use the word restorative. Some had, thought about regenerative. But really, there's this clear kind of pushback now that we feel that the word sustainability does not communicate everything that we do. I think for larger global companies, this is going to be a pretty hard reality check because they're going to have to eventually shift in this direction. But it's much more difficult for them to do so because they are set up on a very different financial structure, which it forces them to really think about maximizing profits every quarter. So can they achieve that? And we haven't really seen that kind of level of success with a global company yet.
Wonderful. Thanks, John Lowy, for the question. So a follow-up question, and yes, please check out the B Lab and the B Corps movement. There's about 5,000 B Corps in the world now. I'm on the advisory board of one, and there's so much self-reporting. Hey, we're great, or marketing, or PR. And B Lab or B Corps are not perfect, but there is a strong certification process, and we actually have about 100 B Corps in Colombia. So there's one cafe where I live in Medellin. It's a little chain, and I mean, I've asked the employees, are they treated much better? Not 100% sure, but I just feel like if I purchase a product from them versus the 100 other competing cafes, they're thinking about these questions and not just talking about it, but trying to implement. So a follow-up question or two questions. Then again, please keep the questions and comments coming, and let us know. Ojo, let us know where you're watching from. Jennifer, let us know where you're watching from. But so much Kathleen and I, one of the ways we stay sane in this crazy world is we like to engage in political comedy. So we go to stand-up comedy here. I did improv theater. I'm not a comedian. But we also watch like The Daily Show and John Oliver. And so today, and I taught and still teach for many years on business, and impact. So John Oliver today, from last night, his theme was on chocolate, and about, both the good and the bad, and just 6% of all the money that the largest chocolate, let's say, manufacturers or the ones who purchase cocoa and then manufacture, only about 6% of that revenue goes to the farmers, and most are living in poverty level. And he was saying, and I agree with this, that so much of what industry does is they do stakeholder engagement, they set goals, but there's very small lack of accountability. And so, Oliver was talking about, they kept saying, oh, we're going to get all the child labor out of our supply chains. And it's been 20 years. And they've made some progress, but basically, can mainstream business truly be regenerative and actually, any company over a certain size, can they make sure in all aspects, from sourcing to end of life use to materials to labor, can they actually not be actively destroying the planet? Or is it like just basically most private sector businesses, if they grow over a certain size, without regulation and just by self-reporting it, they're fundamentally going to be destroying some aspect of the planet?
I like to be hopeful, but there's two parts to this. One of the entrepreneurs in the book said to me that the answer is not that we make, he's the founder of a shoe brand called Veja out of Paris. And he said the answer is not that we become the largest ethical shoe brand in the world. That is not our goal. We want hundreds of Vejas out there. And in fact, one of the B Corp entrepreneurs in this book also said to me, like, there's 5,000 B Corps today, but that's really still a drop in the bucket, right? Like, we need thousands and thousands more. So can we create a version of capitalism where there's far more of these medium-sized actors who are doing things as responsibly and as fairly as possible? That is one vision of capitalism and business that I think is getting a lot of momentum because people are frustrated by the global kind of monopolies in this space and the larger actors. However, at the same time, when you look at supply chains like coffee, like cocoa, especially a lot of agricultural supply chains, I think these bigger companies are going to have to shift sooner or later. Will they go 100% to the other side and be completely responsible? I don't know. That seems like perhaps a big ask. But climate change is affecting these supply chains. If they don't invest in them now, some of them are frankly already disappearing, and they're going to disappear down the road. Their costs are going to go up because of varying weather patterns and all the things that the farmers have to deal with. And the kind of media scrutiny that is here today, I so appreciate when there is pushback on an idea. So carbon credits and carbon offsets have been scrutinized in the media a lot. The Guardian had a really long piece on it, which I thought was brilliant. And that kind of scrutiny is pushing them to think twice now about the way that they approach these projects, right? So the scrutiny can be helpful as long as it's constructive and it's actually helpful and it's kind of moving the needle along slowly in the right direction. I think it's helpful. I think you're seeing now companies that have also backtracked on some of these benchmark goals that they had put out there publicly, right? That we want to be net zero by 2025. And some of them are like, well, maybe not, or maybe carbon neutral, maybe not, because they're realizing the kind of paradox in that statement, and that it's not realistic given their current operations. So the big companies, they are listening. I hear from them, and I'm sure you do too. They are aware. How do we get them to move faster in the other direction? I think we have to show that it's beneficial for their bottom line. At the end of the day, it's still business, right? And so it has to be profitable for them still. And if we can show that, look, consumer trends are changing, you're going to have to shift in this direction. Otherwise, you're going to be canceled out basically by the culture. Then they're far more likely to adopt these practices quicker. There is one last thing I would add to this. When I talk to all these entrepreneurs, Craig, I was just blown away by how many of them were operating by a certain compass personally as founders, as CEOs. And I think that really matters. Like when you have that leadership at the top that just believes in doing things because they are the, better option, it makes it a lot easier for it to trickle down. So whether you're a $2 million company or you're a $50 million company or a $300 million company, it is much easier to do it. And I think that is still what's kind of missing when you look at the global public companies. I don't know if there's enough leadership at the top that's like, yes, let's champion. There's been like the Paul Pullmans, right? But are there enough of them out there? Maybe not yet.
Yeah. And not to criticize Paul Pullman, but it's like Unilever is not a sustainable, so he does talk. I mean, obviously he's not the CEO anymore, and Unilever has made a lot of good efforts, but it's still it's a consumer product goods company
Yeah.
that a lot of their products, like they're trying, but it's still better than a lot. So when people say like Unilever is great, like certain brands within Unilever are great, but it's not anyway. So please keep the questions coming. And so here's a question we ask a lot of people: like, how would you classify your work? Are you like outside the system? Whether you're talking about the system of social impact and capitalism, trying to influence it, but actively engaging? Are you like when people think about their careers in social impact? When someone comes to you and says, like, do you advise me going into a corporation and being in PR or communications or sustainability to try to influence it from the inside? Or is it better to be like in a watchdog group like Global Witness or Greenpeace or someone else, or to be in an activist group that's trying to dismantle it? I'm not asking you for your perspective, but how do you advise people in terms of where how do you help people think about where to go? And I'll put a context. So, I was a full-time professor for 10 years, and I had my favorite class was on business. And I had some of my students go work for big oil companies or big oil company service providers. Some would never do that. But it's like the question is, can they have more impact in the system, or whether, let's say, federal government? So just your thoughts when someone who's maybe a little bit younger is like, should I try to challenge the system or work within it? Because you've engaged with so many people, like what are the pros and cons of each?
I think it also depends on the individual and what their skill set is and what they're good at. I would say it would be wonderful to see more people going within the system and challenging it. There is such when Patagonia puts like a job posting up, I swear there's probably like 10,000 applicants, right? Because everybody wants to work for them kind of thing. And that's fantastic. It's great. They try to hire as many as they can, but we also need people to go work at the other companies that are not on the same wavelength as a Patagonia or whomever you want to, use as an example in the apparel industry, because that's really where the change is going to happen. The challenge you're going to face is that, are you ready for that kind of uphill task? Because it will be challenging. I think the reality is in a lot of these larger organizations, you have sustainability teams that I've seen that are really small, like 4 or 5 people, right? And they're trying to convince everybody else, whether it's C-suite executives or the operation side, the manufacturing side. And that is really the challenge, is that if we can build out that group of people within a large organization, and there is funding and appetite to do that, I think you can have impact maybe even faster. Is it fair to say? I don't know if it's for all industries, but certain manufacturing industries for sure. Um, because you need people in there to show that not only is this the better option, but that this can work for us financially. And if you have more brains that are focused on, I think, both of those goals simultaneously, it's a really compelling answer. I mean, of course, that said, we definitely need people that are activists and, outside the system to keep everybody accountable, and that's an important role to play as well. But if you can, especially I think in your 20s, also go and have that experience, it kind of opens up, your doors in many different ways, because it's up to you then to realize, okay, do I want to sit here and challenge the system for another decade? Or do I want to step out? Maybe I've learned the skills now and go create something that is, impactful and maybe in the same industry or tangential industry. And now you have the tools to do it because you've been there. Um, but I really try to advise people based on who they are as individuals also. Sometimes you have to go do something and realize it's not for you to then realize, okay, I need to go in a different direction. I mean, I did that, right, with television news. So it really does depend on the individual and their personality.
Wonderful. So Jean-Louis has another question. Has some of your storytelling focused on helping consumers better understand the highly extractive nature of our economies and the implications of purchasing decisions? And I would just add one other question to this. There's a lot of surveys that say whatever generation we're in, Generation Z, or that people want impact, but then the question is, are they willing to pay for impact? Because there's a lot of
Mhm.
people, like, if confronted between, let's say, a throwaway something and something that is more expensive and sustainable. So both for Jean-Louis' question, but is there evidence to say that people don't just say it, but they're actually willing, if it costs more, to make that decision?
Yeah. Um, have I done reporting or storytelling on that? Yes. If you look up my name and you find stories, yes, there's loads of stories. I write a lot about companies. So I try to highlight the companies that are doing the work and genuinely trying to kind of move the needle in whatever industry that they're in. Like Craig said, none of them are perfect. None of them are ideal. Yes, some of them may go out of business one day, but that is what I've really been doing with my storytelling all these years, because I was influenced by that solutions journalism thought. So I was like, we need to put these solutions out there. In terms of making purchasing decisions in supply chains, yes. So, for example, if you look up that article about Veja that I wrote in Vice, I think it's still up there on the internet. You can learn about not only the extractive process of what usually goes on in the Amazon, but also how one company is trying to rectify that in their own way by using a material that's actually from the Amazon and paying the people there the same amount of money, if not more money, from what they would have done, in timber or cattle farming or one of the other more extractive industries. Craig, what was the part to your question to follow up? I forget. You followed up with
Like, is,
that.
is there evidence? I've seen a lot of surveys where evidence says that, I think we're now in Generation Alpha for the newest, like my son who's
Yeah.
12, but Generation Z, X, Y, that a lot of people are, both in terms of employment, but also in terms of purchasing, that people say they want to focus more on ethical and regenerative or sustainable products or services. But is there evidence to actually say, will they pay more? Like, not just say they will, but they actually do.
Yeah. There is data now that's showing that, even like, I jokingly call myself a geriatric millennial because, getting up there in the millennial category. But I mean, even for our age group and for the generation right below us, we are seeing this shift in consumer behavior, and it is translating into actual sales in dollars. The thing is that I do recognize that still a lot of the companies that are B Corps or, certified by various organizations and ethical, they do tend to be in the premium side. I agree. I mean, especially for things that we consume every day, whether it's apparel, it's food, shoes, those kind of things. Um, so my response is always this, because I'm not somebody, I mean, I work in media. I'm not, bringing home bucket loads of money either, but it's a lifestyle. And are you willing to kind of shift your lifestyle in a way that, if you are somebody who, consumes a lot, to consuming less, and it's perfectly fine to buy a regular pair of shoes. They don't have to be ethically sourced, but just like wear them to the ground, right? As much as you can, or can they be recycled, and like look into that. I think part of the problem also lies in, we focus a lot on the consumers, and yes, we all have a role to play, but also on the production side, there's so much overproduction of goods in the world. I mean, that's really the unsexy story that doesn't get told as much. But if you go to factories and you go to warehouses, you see so much plastic being used, so much overproduction, and so much of the stuff that we make like doesn't even make it to the consumer. It just gets trashed, whether it's food, whether it's apparel, whatever. So there's also that kind of side of the equation where it's, as a consumer, do what you can within your purchasing power, but don't beat yourself up if you can't, buy only organic cotton or whatever fair trade products and all of that. So buy the regular stuff, but just buy less of it. I mean, we're seeing now also this conversation of like, do you want to have a wardrobe that's stuffed with just sustainable brands, sustainable fashion brands? No, because that's also like unnecessary, right? So one question that came up a lot that all these entrepreneurs kind of made me think about as well is this question of how much is enough. And when you start to think about it, you're like, this is a personal level question of what you can do in your life. But it's also a question, obviously, for the business community of how much is enough. And are we willing to kind of adjust our definition of enough?
So that kind of connects to the degrowth movement. I mean, there's all different types of terminology. And I'll just give a concrete example. So we compost, and Catalina is much more into composting than I was, and still, so we don't throw away any, fruit, eggshells, all that stuff. It all gets composted. And I
Right.
would say I was more reluctant. That we do it equally now, but it takes a little bit of work. But it reduces. We still produce a lot of garbage, and because we compost, sometimes it generates all sorts of scary soldier flies and things. But like it's amazing. We just compost and put it in our garden. Um, but what do you think the fundamental nature for so many economies around the world is like consume, 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 because that leads to growth and jobs and taxes. And so, I mean, any thoughts? Have you done any writing on, degrowth, some of the leaders in degrowth, or have you seen any companies apart from Patagonia who says like, don't buy, like, like say use whatever product you have until it can't be used 1 second more, and then figure out what the end of life of that is. So is that catching on not just in the consumer community, but are any businesses saying like either designing for maximum life or just saying like this is a one time every 15, 20-year purchase and we're not trying to upsell you every 2 years?
I think that that's the real challenge here is that can we, I mean, yes, there are companies that are definitely doing it today. There are companies that are advocating. Veja is another one that said, we release X number of shoes. If we sell out, sorry, we sell out. We're not going to go back and make more of that collection. And if you don't get your hands on it, I'm sorry. So they're recognizing that they don't want to be part of that overproduction cycle that often happens in that industry. But there are definitely these companies that are speaking out and saying that we don't need to make crazy amounts of profit also. And how are we going to allocate that profit amongst all of our workforce too, right? So employee ownership is really taking off as well. Um, all of that is taking off. Is it taking off fast enough? No, I don't think so. Circular economy is definitely happening. You are seeing more and more companies designing with circularity. The cosmetics company, which produces so much waste, personal care products, in packaging and in, just single-use kind of plastic containers and all of that. They're being forced to think about all this because consumers are pushing back and saying, well, this doesn't seem right. Like, I don't feel good about buying this plastic tube every 2 weeks or so. And then, where does it go? So that is all happening. I will say packaging, honestly, I almost have empathy for these guys that are in the packaging industry because it is such a hard problem to solve. You want a material that's resilient. You want a material that's cheap. You want a material that does the job that it's supposed to do of holding a liquid or whatever it is. And can you do all of that and make it biodegradable, compostable, bio-based, whatever route you want to go? They're still expensive. I mean, there's still like the cost has not come down. And so I think the innovation we're going to see in that space, and there's loads of companies that are shifting in that direction, is going to be really interesting in the next 5 years. I was at Expo West earlier this year, which is such an interesting conference for everybody in the natural food industry. It's like 50,000 people convene in Anaheim, California every year. It's like a huge Super Bowl for the natural food industry. And I was blown away by how many packaging companies there were. And they're all trying to figure out the next frontier of packaging. And so there are companies also that have, like, for example, they've tried using a natural material or a more eco-friendly material. but then it didn't survive, getting into a container and being shipped 3 months across the world and all of that. So then they've had to resort back to plastic. So there are companies that are actively trying to figure out how to make these models more circular. And in fact, many of the bigger ones are also trying when it especially comes to packaging. So yes, we're seeing movement in that direction. The growth question I think is really interesting, and I don't have the answer to that, and that's something I want to dig into more in the coming months and years, because I think it was Paul Hawken who said, you cannot have infinite growth with finite resources or a finite planet, when he was speaking about regeneration. And we kind of have to ask ourselves this question of like, when is this trajectory to, whether it's 5% GDP growth or whatever growth model you want to follow, seem a bit unsustainable, for the lack of a better word. And I do think that that's a really important area of research and discussion.
Thank you so much. So I'll ask a follow-up question, and a couple more have come in, and we have about 10 minutes left if other people have questions or comments. So when you think about your work, I just want to ask a little bit in terms of, with machine learning and AI, how is your work changing at all in terms of how you're reporting and using these tools? And then for others, whether they want to go into media, communications, journalism, marketing, for people, let's say early or mid-career, like what is your advice for how to start thinking about these tools, both the good and the bad? What, have you seen interesting uses in some of the companies or other media professionals? And just like, where do you go to kind of think about upskilling related to these things?
I think it's so interesting. I actually downloaded a course from the internet, from one of those platforms where you can buy, a course that's like a 10-part course kind of thing to watch about AI, because there's two responses to this I'm seeing. Some people, especially in the sort of like impact community, are just saying, sorry, we're not going to engage with this. Like, we still believe in doing everything with human hands and human mind and all of that. But there's a part of me that's like, I'm part of that generation that grew up without a cell phone. I was that last generation that didn't grow up with a cell phone. And now we look at how the smartphone has just like transformed the way we communicate and work. And I don't think it's all terrible. Some of it is really valuable. I mean, my career depends on it in many ways. So I actually downloaded a course on AI. I'm very eager to learn more. I've played around with it and seen what it can do in the world of storytelling. I think there's always going to be a role for people who want to do storytelling for that creative aspect that it doesn't know how to do yet, and the analytic aspect, right? So when you go to college and you're asked to churn out these essays, it's that analytic thinking that professors are trying to teach you, of like taking in lots of information, digesting it, and then how do you analyze it and put it out there in a way that's easy to understand. I don't think it can do that yet. What it can help with is the background and the research. And I have used it, sometimes when I want to familiarize myself with a topic, I'll type it into ChatGPT and I'll just get a great overview. The challenge with it is that it's not up to date, right? So it's still a little bit behind. So it's not going to give you the latest information. So you still have to go in and sort of fact check sometimes, or get the latest data that's up to the last month or week that you're looking at. But I think it's actually a really interesting landscape. And if you are getting into this space, I would say you should at least familiarize yourself with the tools that are out there. And I have friends who are in the film side of things, and they're experimenting with what AI can do with film. I think as long as we're acknowledging that this is not being done in person, like this is computer generated, there isn't as much of an ethical question there. But for sure, I think it's going to be part of the tools that we use in the next decade. So it seems that we need to be open to it. We need to learn and play with it, at least, to see where it fits into our lives. Oh, Craig, you're on mute, I think.
Yes, AI. We're playing with all the AI tools and doing a course on AI impact professionals, and I think, in my opinion, I think it's going to be like the internet. Initially wonderful, and then in the end, like let's say 30-40% super positive. And that if you use it right and think about ethics and pricing and privacy, like it can free up so much time to really do the deep impact work and networking and thinking. Probably 30-40% is going to be somewhat neutral, and 30% is going to be horrific with the
Yeah.
deep fakes and just automation. So it's going to be a mix of everything. But I would
Right.
encourage everyone to at least explore how it can be used and their critiques, because it's happening. And I just put in, we had a recent podcast with Kiran Singh Sira, who was
Mhm.
one of the world's experts in storytelling for impact. I think it was 2 or 3 episodes ago. So you can find it on our website. And he led the International Storytelling Center for a decade and does a lot on communication for impact. So we're kind of having a storytelling theme here. So another question from John Louise. Thanks for so many questions. How have you seen your storytelling trigger a deeper impact? And what, for those working in stories and media and communications, what leads one story to having a, let's say, a deeper impact or people connect with more than others?
Ooh, two big questions. What has worked and what is the response I get? I do get messages from people who have read things and they felt moved to either start a company or to change the way that their company operates. And so I do know that the message is getting out there and people are being, influenced by it in a positive way. And what really gets people to do it? This is something that there's two parts to this. I would say is one, sometimes people just need a case study to show how it works, so that they can then kind of go out there and replicate it in their own way, and that really does get people to action. So if you can show people a path, that's really the big debate right now, right? With these global public companies, is like, how do we get them on board to do this? Because nobody has really successfully done it and shown that this is the path that we could follow. So I think case studies are really helpful. The other thing is also, I would say, people really want content that's engaging. Like if you are just going to put out stuff to them that tells them this is the thing you should do because it's better, because it's more ethical, no, it's not going to happen. People are much more moved by something that is almost like personal storytelling, using characters to tell your stories, using a human connection that makes them feel more, it feels more personal. It's not just something I should do because it's the moral higher ground. And that's actually something I see that's a gap when you look at films. Like a lot of times you see these documentaries, right? And they're just really heavy and overwhelming. And it's like, oh gosh, you walk away feeling like, oh, I don't know. I mean, is the world just going in the wrong direction? And what can I do? And instead, if you watch a film that has, the story kind of laced into it of impact, but that's not the core focus, it's not a documentary preaching at you, people are far more likely to walk away and say, oh, that's interesting. Like, how do I think about that in my organization? Or how do I do that? I think the storytelling space actually has a lot of improvement. We've seen a lot of traditional documentaries on these issues. We still haven't seen a lot of films that sort of like cross over and do this in an entertaining way, and that entertainment factor is still really important for people to engage. The jargon is kind of a turnoff most of the time, right? So it's like, how do you talk about this as if you're just a human being connecting with another human being? I'm trying to think back. I mean, there's so many films, for example, that Participant Media, the company that's based out of LA, has put out over the years, that have had these storylines embedded in them, but they're not straight up always documentaries. So I was like, for example, I was just watching a documentary last night that was about the regenerative space, and even I felt like, I'm like, oof, I don't know if I could make it an hour and 40 minutes through this. So think about really, how do you get people's interest in a way that's very easy and personable?
Wonderful. So I just added, as you were saying, that a couple of resources. So we've talked a lot about solutions journalism. David Bornstein and I were media fellows at the Opportunity Collaboration Conference, so that's also a great space. But I think they're up to 12,000 stories they were hiring. I'm not sure they still are for an African lead, but it's the best, I think, resource if you're thinking about constructive engagement journalism that's not hero worshiping or just like here's the magic solution. So it's problematizing, but it's also not like it's not depressing. So I think it's an amazing resource. Goodable is an interesting startup we've invested in a little bit. Mohammed Lila, who's a former war journalist. Um, Positive News out of the UK, Participant Media. So, and kind of a question related to this as we start to close, like where do you go both for staying informed and engaged, like the things that inspire you, and what's your community in terms of like, do you go to any conferences or online events or newsletters, like for people who want to really understand and engage and stay informed, like what are your places you recommend people go apart from these, conferences and those type of things, podcasts?
If you're in the impact sector, the conference that I went to for many years before before the pandemic was actually the Skoll conference, and Skoll used to have one in Oxford, England. So if you are Europe-based, that's an easier one to get to. I just thought it was a really lovely conference. The people that came there were very easy to engage with, and you had a lot of industry leaders, but it was very relaxed kind of thing, and it was smaller. I appreciate the smaller gatherings more than the larger ones. I just think it's gives you more opportunity to connect with other people. I mean, TED is another great organization and place to kind of meet people who are thinking about different innovations and new concepts in their industries. Obviously, it's a pretty exclusive event, but I think if you can go to one of the more local ones, I think that's great. In terms of where do I go to for news, honestly, I don't read a lot of news from traditional news outlets anymore. I'm subscribed to a variety of impact related newsletters and Instagram accounts and LinkedIn, profiles and things like that. And that's where I'm really seeing a lot of the daily updates about this sector. But I did subscribe to Apple News, I have to say, last year, because there were just so many, platforms, and it's like, how do you manage so many subscriptions? And I have to say, it's actually been really helpful to just get a sense of, you can type in whatever term you want and see the latest that's being done by traditional media. So that's a really affordable and easy tool if you want to follow a specific thread. I think platforms like ProPublica and all, they have great reporting, and they've been doing really great independent reporting for years. And so if you want an alternative perspective to traditional media, those are really great places to go to as well, finding those kind of organizations. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. I find that podcasts are really interesting these days, and I put it on when I'm, doing some other sort of menial tasks. And I find that to be really almost meditative if you can get a podcast that's like 30, 40 minutes long where somebody really dives deep into a topic.
So we'll wrap up in 2 minutes. So yeah, ProPublica Global Press Journal
Yes.
Institute is amazing. Christy Hargaves, and they've trained, I think it's exclusively or mostly female journalists in very rigorous journalism from around
Yes.
the world, and they're reporting on their issues instead of someone from outside, and they syndicate it a lot, so it's great. I really like Rest of World from Sophie Schmidt.
Mm-hmm.
It's about tech.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of the most interesting newsletters so far. It's still free. They'll probably start charging, but it's like tech from
Mm-hmm.
around the world. And I just think some of the stories are great. So last two questions, just to wrap up. So when you are not working or doing other things, is there any skill apart from AI that you're currently working on learning, or something you aspire to learn?
I'm actually learning how to grow my own fruit and veg, which I feel like is a very practical skill, and it's very connected to what we do during the day. But during the pandemic, I started building vegetable boxes and growing my own vegetables. And I was very unsuccessful in the beginning. And now I'm learning. And it gives you a different perspective. I mean, I do a lot of reporting on agriculture also, and when you're looking at these monolith giant farms and you realize the issues that you're having, and now you're digging in and just trying to do it in your own little backyard. So, I mean, that's a very different kind of skill, I would say, but that's something that I've been doing. And to be honest with you, Craig, I also now am really thinking a lot about how to turn the brain off. And so I think that that's so important. And we're all kind of so wired with all of this information coming at us all the time. So I actually go for walks in nature regularly where I don't have headphones. Sometimes I leave my phone behind in the car also, and I just tune out. And nature is very inspiring. I mean, if you go and you spend time in nature, and you can really get your body to kind of readjust on a different time clock, it can teach you. I mean, there's so much in nature to learn from. All these cycles that we're looking at, circularity, all of that, nature does it really well.
Yeah, for Kata's birthday, we went to a part of Colombia called the Meta, to the Rainbow River in Caña Cristales. And I say honestly, I didn't want to go, but it was her dream, so we went. And our 12-year-old like, what? No cell phone? And but it's one of the best examples of sustainable tourism I've ever seen. And we stayed in an eco lodge run by biologists, where it's all community tourism integrated, and it just was amazing. And after a couple of days, you're just like in the zone, like frogs,
Yeah.
like just incredible. So the last question before we finally wrap up. So for people to engage with you, is LinkedIn the best channel? Your website? Do you have a newsletter? And also, you talked about other services. Like if somebody wanted to pitch you, I don't want you to be inundated, but both in terms of pitching you, or also just like what other services do you offer? A little more detail. So if someone's looking for like an impact communicator, like what's the range of things that you might offer, and just how people
Sure.
might approach you. Not, please don't inundate Esha. And then also where to get your book, and then we'll stop.
The book, actually, I have a copy here. Yeah, I have a copy of this one I can share. Here's the book. You can buy it at Amazon. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble. You can buy it at Bookshop. You can buy it anywhere you buy books. In terms of where to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at my website, which is just my name, eshachhabra.com. If you want to pitch me your organization, kindly do so after the new year. I've just been inundated with book stuff this year, but I'm always open to pitches. So feel free to send me a note if you feel compelled. And then what do I do beyond the world of journalism? I do editorial services for organizations in the impact sector. That's what I like to work with. So they can be foundations, you can be in the private sector, whatever, role you're playing in impact. And I've done everything from ghostwriting to creating content for them, whether it's a series of articles to just, a couple pieces. I have helped, with writing op-ed pieces for founders and CEOs, anything that has to do with editorial, any, particular format, whether it's a report or something more creative, a campaign. I'm happy to help and think about how you can communicate these things in a way that's engaging for folks.
And thank you so much for generously sharing your time and wisdom, answering questions, and talking about gardening. We actually got our first oranges last year, and it was the best orange I've ever had. Just like 30 oranges from our orange tree, and it's like, so please thank you everyone for joining us from around the globe. Please follow Esha on LinkedIn. Check out PCDN. If you we would deeply appreciate if you share this episode. It should be up Friday in our podcast, one of other 120 episodes, and please consider rating and sharing. If you have podcast pitches, feel free to message us, and keep working for impact. And any last question, any forthcoming pieces? I mean, you're always working on stuff, but anything that's coming out in the next month or two that you might say, hey, people, stay tuned if you're interested in this?
I don't have any journalistic pieces that I can announce, but I did speak at TED last month, and that video will be out. So if you're looking at, regenerative business and you want like a quick 10-minute overview, that can be a great resource that people can look out for.
Okay.
It'll be up on the YouTube channel. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll make sure to share it. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful morning. And again, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.